start this week's show, I just wanted to give you a little reminder about our motorsport sister podcast, Mike's Out. Mike's Out comes out every 2 weeks and is hosted by my colleague Kian Brittle and features the rest of the Black Book team talking all things motorsport business. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. But for those of you that prefer to tune in live, every 2 weeks, Mike's Out goes out as a live stream on the Black Book LinkedIn feed where you can interact with the whole of the Black Book team. Now, on with your regularly scheduled programming. Right, hello. Welcome to the latest episode of the SportsPro podcast. Remote recording for once. That's because I'm joined by our Hampshire correspondent, Ed Dixon, also known as our deputy editor. Hello, Ed Dixon. How are you?
I'm good, mate. Hope all's well.
Very well here in London Towers, HQ of SportsPro. Summer holidays, so there's a reduced cast of the SportsPro podcast this week. We're down to a two-man job, but later on we will have some fascinating extra guest in the form of USOPC Chief Executive Sarah Hirshland, who was talking to Sam Carp, who's obviously been in Paris for the last couple of weeks at the Olympics, so that's very exciting. But Ed, I thought we would just do a little roundup of some of the more eye-catching sports business news stories from the last couple of weeks or last week or so. The first place I wanted to go, and this is a very busy name in my time covering the sports industry, and that's DAZN. Again, being very busy. What have they been up to, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to make this the Ligue hour, I think that's probably been their standout in the last week or so. I mean, so basically Ligue 1 French soccer's top flight, they've finally confirmed their domestic rights deal for the 2024 to 2029 cycle. I think it's probably worth, before we get into sort of the nitty gritty of the deal, just to sort of go back a little bit further, just to realise like how much of a protracted saga this was. I mean, Ligue 1 clubs have been feeling the effect of the collapse of their deal with MediaPro since, for the best part of 4 years now. There's been a lot of back and forth. It's been a tumultuous period, really. Canal Plus, they first tried to hand back its rights after the MediaPro fallout. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of disagreements there. Amazon then secured the bulk of the league's domestic rights from 2021 to end of the 2023-24 season. And then Canal Plus threatened to boycott its agreement for an attempt to terminate that sub-license deal was defeated in court. But Canal Plus then, for the next cycle, ruled itself out, and it seemed that the ball was then in DAZN's court. Obviously, Amazon was linked as well. A couple of other broadcasters were linked as well. But yeah, the ink is dry. The deal is signed, I should say. Yeah, and DAZN's package is reportedly worth 400 million euros, and then beIN's agreement is worth about 100 million euros from what we've seen. So yeah, it's
messy, shall we say?
Yeah, in short, not great, could have done better. But I think what the deal will do is sort of provide something resembling stability that has been sorely lacking in domestic French football for the last couple of years.
I think that's definitely the case, isn't it? Like, that's really what these agreements do. One of the reasons why no major league really has decided to go down that direct-to-consumer option, and I think we might talk about that, is that this provides guaranteed revenues. So even if they're lower than maybe you've been expecting or previously had in the case of Ligue 1, at least you know what they're going to be. So you can set your budgets, and that's budgets for staff, players, any other investments, upkeep, training, ground maintenance, venue maintenance, all of it. You know what you can spend, and that's now what the French clubs have, and it's lower than it used to be. It means that they'll probably become even more of a selling league, I think, Ligue 1 now. I think we've seen that trend a lot in the last few years of the Premier League, especially really raiding Ligue 1 for talent, taking it away quite early, meaning that sort of, despite being the top flight league in the country, which arguably produces the best national team, not a lot of those national team players really stick around. The last great player to leave was this summer with Kylian Mbappe. But again, a sign of the times that even PSG, as well muddied as they are, weren't able to hold on to him. Mostly, I think, because of the sort of the perceived lack of strength in that league. But for DAZN, I don't know, Ed, for me, this feels like they've almost followed like an Amazon-style model and taken an opportunistic deal to pick up the domestic top-flight rights in a country where they were seeking to grow at a relatively cheap price. Do you think this is a good deal for them?
I think so, yeah. It gets the biggest game of the week at a relatively small cost. And, so it's a more economical deal. And it immediately becomes one of the country's top sports broadcasters without, having to break the bank too much. I think I still think like Ligue 1 did just back itself into a corner. Like as you said, they weren't ruling out starting their own D2C platform, but the having to get that off the ground for the new season, implementing it, testing it, all the rest of it, it was just carried so much risk. And indeed, it would have kicked off most likely with depleted revenues for the league and its teams. So, unsurprisingly, it split the league. And it soon became clear that the preference was for a much smaller kind of reliable source of income. You kind of want to know what you're dealing with for the next 4 to 5 years, really, considering the turmoil, should we put it, over the last couple of years. You sort of, clubs, I should say, would at least want to know what hand they've been dealt in that intervening period. But yeah, I think for DAZN, it's a win for them.
Yeah, and I mean, DAZN now, right, so you look at their sort of portfolio of rights across Europe. Italy, they're the main broadcast partner. Germany, all right, there's a bit of a legal issue there currently, but they are in that picture. Spain, no legal issues there, but again, they're in the broadcast picture. And France. So they are part of the main domestic broadcast package in 4 of the 5 big leagues, you'd say. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're going to be entering the Premier League picture anytime soon. I think that looks fairly sewn up for the time being. But it looks like a media company that is feeling good about itself again after a tough pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. Mainland Europe, undoubtedly, they've made some aggressive but considered moves, and that's reflected in their rights portfolio. Yeah, I think they've been open about the fact the Premier League in their home market in the UK is going to be, their next big milestone if and when that happens. I mean, just jumping ahead over to the UK, they did another deal that they've done recently is a deal for the National League, which covers the semi-professional 5th and 6th tiers of English soccer. And you sort of think, well, hang on, it's sort of 5th and 6th tier soccer may not be the most attractive property on paper, particularly for a broadcaster wants to hold premium rights. Obviously, DAZN aren't shy of being quite eclectic with their choice of sports rights in markets they're trying to get a foothold in. But I think, again, on paper, it seems like quite a smart move. The National League has arguably had more exposure than, like League One and League Two, which is sort of bundled the rights for that. They're bundled with the Championship. And the National League, I should say, they believe that merging their own streaming platform, which was apparently, depending on who you believe, created at the request of Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney's Wrexham, it's going to provide DAZN an opportunity for other clubs to capitalise on any surge in international appeal. Obviously, Wrexham are long gone, but I'm sort of intrigued to see, I'm particularly intrigued by that deal, how it almost acts like a sort of dress rehearsal light for DAZN soccer in the UK, because, that's their sort of North Star, if you want to call it that. And if they can showcase what they're about with the National League, then I think obviously the Premier League are going to be more inclined to go for the highest bidder, but it could cement DAZN as a serious player when it comes to football rights in the UK, which is sort of something that it's been very light on, particularly in this market. It's known best for boxing in this country, and that's kind of an image it's been trying to shift in recent years.
Yeah, that's definitely where it came into it, right? And it's not, I don't think it's been shy about the fact it wants to get football. It was heavily linked with the EFL deal, which in the end ended up being renewed with Sky. They talked about wanting to get the Premier League. But yeah, this to me feels like a kind of first strike for them into it. And like we say, semi-professional football, but the National League is still watched by people. It's not quite as high profile as it was a couple of years ago when Wrexham were bringing a lot of attention to the league, but it's still got some teams in there that will draw crowds, and teams will get relegated out of League Two that other people will want to watch. And I think you're right. If you can make a success of that, then yeah, it does kind of give you a little bit more of a stake. People take you more seriously in the UK if you're a football broadcaster. They've also been renewing their Premier League rights. They've done that in Spain. Yeah, for me, DAZN looks like it's definitely gearing itself up and is feeling more confident. Just to go back to Ligue a second. Now, for me, this is something I think we've covered a fair bit and written about a fair bit on SportsPro. Ligue, the LFP, basically a case study in what not to do when it comes to media rights negotiations. Yes, Canal Plus were always going to be perturbed that they ended up paying more per game than other broadcasters for their rights. But the way that was handled by the LFP was just like, don't piss off your biggest broadcaster. It's quite simple. Like, don't make them angry, because really, like, they're the ones that pay the bills. There's a reason that Premier League and Sky have such a long ongoing relationship. And that's because they're very close. They work hand in hand in order to grow the product. Sky has grown in hand with the Premier League since it launched in 1992. And those rights aren't growing at the same rate as they were recently, but the Premier League still knows it can call up Sky and get a decent financial package when those rights come up for renewal. And the fact that other people keep on coming into the market and challenging Sky, and none of them really have ever got close to taking the main bags away from them, is an example of like the importance that the Premier League places on that relationship. It looks like the same in Spain with Movistar. And it's only really in those kind of less mature pay TV markets, Italy, Germany, France, where this has happened. And actually, it's certainly been as a detriment in Italy. We've not quite seen the same thing in Germany, where the rights have sort of stagnated around the same price, but they aren't falling dramatically. Whereas in France, massive decline in the value of those rights because the league hasn't properly maintained its relationship with its most important broadcaster. It's a very strange one, but well done for DAZN for getting that deal, and who knows whether or not it'll be a success. This also might be a chance, I think, for Canal to come back into this picture. One of the reasons DAZN was able to enter the Ligue 1 rights picture last season was because of that deal it struck with Canal Plus to see its channels, see its streaming platform carried on Canal Plus distribution boxes, etc. So I don't think this is the last of Canal Plus as a Ligue 1 broadcaster. It might just take a different approach.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Just in the interest of housekeeping, actually, for our long-suffering producer, I did say that DAZN got the biggest game of the week at a relatively small cost. I did mean be in. But anyway, that just a bit of housekeeping there for anyone who wants to dive into the comment section.
Sticklers for accuracy on this podcast, as you know it.
Absolutely. To your point, if you're a league, particularly one that's had a tricky couple of years like Ligue, biting the hand that feeds you or to that effect is probably not the smartest move. I mean, you got to remember, like the LFP, they wanted this deal to kind of narrow the revenue gap between Liga and the big five. Instead, it's just got wider. And I think this vicious cycle that you've mentioned before is just going to continue in that clubs are going to have to keep selling players or letting them go, and that affects how the LFP can broaden the appeal of the league and in turn increase the value of its media rights. So, yeah, that trend is likely to continue now.
I agree 100%, especially when you've got other leagues, the Saudi Pro League being an example of new money kind of entering the market. There's going to be more competition for those players that you're producing to, and that reduces the eyeballs, especially internationally into your league. I think like local fans are always going to be local fans. People in France are always going to want to watch French football. I think that's a European trend that's not going to be bucked for a long, long time. But yeah, it does make it a lot harder for LFP to grow. Also, penny for CPC's thoughts, right? They invested how much money in this, and they're getting nowhere near as much as probably they thought they would have. And the clubs too. They took this money from CVC with the idea that there was going to be increased revenues off the back of a shiny new media rights deal. And lo and behold, they end up with a cut price financial agreement. Any further thoughts, Ed?
Yeah, just on CVC, I mean, it was 1.5 billion euros, and that was for a 30% stake in the LFP's new commercial company, which oversees media rights sales. That was back in 2022. Penny for the thoughts, the reports are that the CVC has not been particularly thrilled with how the rights sale has been handled. So I think time's a great healer, and hopefully this deal does provide a degree of stability where clubs know what they deal with. But if it's going to be that springboard for Liga, being further spoken about in the same conversation, if you like, more closely with Premier League, La Liga, etc., this deal isn't it?
Certainly not. Let's go to Paris. We haven't been fortunate enough to be on the ground in France, although I'm not sure you've got a passport at the moment, Ed. So maybe you're happy with this scenario. But it looks like Paris 2024 is going to be a real rebound games for the Olympics and for its broadcasters. Have you got any numbers to hand to demonstrate this at all?
Yeah, I should just say my passport I haven't had it taken away from me for any misadventures or anything like that. I think it's gathering dust somewhere in one of my many drawers. I'll put that on my to-do list. I need to dig out my passport. Thanks for the reminder.
Yeah, it's always an interesting observation, which is dustier, Ed's passport or Ed's wallet.
Well, I do have a fear of flying, and maybe I have a fear of spending money at the moment. Times are tough. The top line numbers that you mentioned, I mean, the ISC said a couple of days ago that Paris 2024 is on track to break broadcast and digital engagement records. Just to pull a few out, yeah, Olympic social media channels, they've generated more than 8.5 billion engagements during the first week of the Games. I mean, for context, that's 40% more than the whole of Tokyo 2020. The opening ceremony was watched by 23.4 million. on France Television. Yeah, I mean, NBC is another notable one. 34.6 million people have watched its coverage alone on Saturday. That was the 3rd of August. The IOC and its broadcast partners are going to be breathing a big sigh of relief. I mean, NBC in particular, I mean, Gary Zenkel, who's NBC's Olympics president, he told Sam Carp that it has been a relief. You know, they saw significant slump in viewership for Tokyo and Beijing. And when you're forking out $7.65 billion.
And you've got an Olympics in your home country coming up next too.
Indeed. You kind of want things to stick. So I think there's a number of things really that have created a sort of not a perfect storm, but have just made the conditions far more appealing for viewers. There was, I think primarily it's the fact that, you know, crowds are back, fans are back, you know, it adds to the whole atmosphere thing. You don't have the controversy that was circling Beijing for the 2022 Winter Olympics. You could also make the case of how strong a product the Winter Olympics is and how much that sort of that brand strength has fallen. Obviously, Tokyo 2020 was, affected by COVID. I mean, just going back to the previous Olympics, Rio, it was a more favourable time zone for NBC, but it was multiple issues with that. I mean, ultimately, it was labelled a financial disaster for the organisers, but that kind of encapsulated a games that was not without issues. So the fact that Paris is well versed in hosting, it hasn't been all smooth sailing. Just look at the Olympic ceremony, for example, rain drenched. There are a number of things that have fallen in broadcasters in the IOC's favour. And I think, if anything, one of the main aims of this games was to set it up for future success, you know, demonstrate, you know, why it is this showpiece event, you know, the ultimate sports gathering, and why it remains relevant in the wider sort of sports climate, if you like. And I think that's what Paris 2024 is doing. So the IOC, NBC and others, there'll be a lot of back patting and sighs of relief. But obviously, we've still got a couple of days to go, but it'll be interesting to see what the final figures are when closing ceremony wraps up.
It just looks a lot more normal, doesn't it, than the last couple of Olympics we've seen. And the IOC's next run of hosts is a lot safer. Obviously, we go to LA next. After that, talking summer games here. After that, we go to Brisbane. 2036 and 2040 yet to be decided, but London's already chucked its name in the hat for 2040. What they do with 2036, I think, actually will be very interesting, because it seems like there's been some risks taken, especially thinking Sochi, Beijing twice, games where you're walking into a sort of PR minefield. They aren't always perhaps going to be as popular as a game in a nice, friendly Western country. So yeah, what they do with that one will be interesting, whether or not they've just like, that's kind of the model now. It's like, all right, yeah, what works? It's big capitals in big Western countries. We'll see. But you think that there's probably been some lessons from the last few Olympics for the IOC. I mean, one, try not to have a games in the middle of a pandemic, which there was nothing to be had there. Speaking without any data whatsoever, I've always sort of been slightly wondered why the viewership was so low during the pandemic. Like, it didn't make lots of logical sense to me. People didn't have anything else to do but to sit at home and watch TV. But for some reason, that meant that people didn't want to watch the Olympics. Just a thought.
I'm not one to dwell on speculation, but I think unless I'm struggling to meet a word count, but I think what Paris 2024 is doing is actually highlighting how much the Olympics is almost ready-made for streaming, for D2C platforms. It just seems odd now that you could only, even as recently as something like 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, you primarily relied on linear television, and you were sort of limited to, particularly in the UK. I mean, during London 2012, we had the red button, but if you had much less adoption, so you would rely on BBC One, BBC Two, possibly BBC Three and one or two other channels. But whereas now, I mean, the likes of Peacock and Warner Bros. Discovery, they've really leaned into the streaming element of it, made it a streaming first product. At least that's what it feels like. I mean, that is kind of backed up in the viewership that we're seeing. So, you know, WBD, total unique streaming viewers for Tokyo 2020, that was beaten by Paris 2024 in the first 2 days. I mean, Peacock as well, viewing on that exceeded Tokyo 2020 and Beijing 2022 combined after just 2 days. Some sports are finding it harder, or events even becoming harder to make that migration into streaming, whereas I think with something like the Olympics, where there's so much going on, it's almost tailor-made for that streaming proposition. And I think streaming the Olympics is, without wanting to speak for everyone, but like, it just feels normal. Like, you go, you know, you don't like this, you can go for that.
I'd be interested to see the reaction to this, because like at the last Olympics, there was a lot of uproar in the UK that you couldn't suddenly, having had the option to tune into pretty much every sport you wanted via the iPlayer, you could no longer do that because those were the rights that Warner Brothers Discovery had. This time the BBC was quite clear in saying, look, we only have these two channels. It's all that we're allowed to show. Interesting that those Warner Brothers Discovery numbers don't give you what the breakdowns are in each market, I would guess. And I think the BBC's actually done a really nice job with this, is that the BBC's coverage is still most of the eyeballs. Like, that's not really a surprise. It's a public service broadcast and it's free. But I bet that their streaming channels are probably still better watched than Eurosports. But I'm not basing that on anything. I just think that's the way that people consume this stuff. But yeah, I think you're right. Certainly with regards to Peacock, it really feels like they've found their feet in this games. You've said a lot of things about their coverage, a lot of stuff about Snoop Dogg. This does really feel like we're in a mature place with streaming now, and this Olympics has shown that off.
Sorry to interrupt your podcast. This is just a quick reminder that as a listener to the podcast, you can get a exclusive 10% discount on an annual SportsPro Plus membership. If you're not yet a SportsPro Plus member, I implore you to go and sign up. It's our subscription product. It's packed full of extremely important and very useful features, inclusive but not limited to our media hub, which features things like market spotlights, media rights trackers, quarterly deal analysis, all of our extensively researched and wonderfully produced commercial guides. SportsPro Plus readers also get access to our in-depth analysis of the biggest news in the sports industry. And as I said, SportsPro podcast listeners can get an exclusive 10% discount now. That is if you use the code podcast10 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply, and that is for an annual subscription only. Thank you very much, and let's return to our regularly scheduled listening.
Final thing I wanted to hit, and given that you are a resident James Jones apologist, reporter from the South Central, I guess we'd call it, county of Hampshire. I don't know how to describe it geographically. What's happened? Why is your local team suddenly in the news, shall I say?
Well, they're about to be acquired by the Delhi Capital's co-owners, GMR Group. Reports of a £120 million deal, going to gain complete control of Hampshire, and notably a 51% stake in Southern Brave, the 100 franchise. And that apparently includes an option of acquiring all shares in the Brave as well. I mean, it's significant for a number of reasons. You know, the English county system is traditional, some would say to its detriment, but the arrival of GMR, we've seen IPL owners linked with county teams before. There was Yorkshire, for example. Did feel inevitable that Indian-based investment would arrive at some point. I think just looking at the broader picture, this takeover, I think it will encourage the ECB because they're trying to woo not just IPL franchise owners, but loads of other investors to invest in the 100 and the teams. You know, they hope to raise about £500 million from stake sales, which will be used for a number of things, including using towards the professional and grassroots game. But there have been murmurings that the bidding process or the investment process has stagnated a little bit. There has been interest, but the whole process apparently has hit sort of choppy waters. I think some parties are quite concerned about sort of some of the hoops they've got to jump through, some of the sort of T's and C's, if you like. So the fact that GMR have got involved, it could sort of be a domino effect. They look like they're going to take the plunge, and given the various names that have been linked to the 100 franchise, I mean, Saudi Arabia's PIF, that's been linked with buying a new team in Durham. I think even just to segue back to Wrexham, you know, Rob McElhenney and Ryan Reynolds have been linked with buying the Welsh Fire. So the fact that GMR are taking the first step with Hampshire and indeed the Southern Brave, it could well be that the rest of the year is populated by lots of other investment deals coming up, which is what the ECB wants.
Yeah, and with Hampshire, they don't just get the teams, they also get a test match venue, right? So it's not Old Trafford or Edgbaston or Trent Bridge, certainly not either of the London venues, but it is in the circuit. It's used a lot in one days. This was popular in the lockdown because of its ability to sort of host the game in a bubble. And as you said, they get 100 franchise. I'd love to know the breakdown of how each part of this business was calculated, because if, for example, say we know that the ECB's goal with the franchise sales is to raise £500 million. If the Brave in this deal are valued at somewhere near 80, then you'd say they're well on track to get that if this is for Hampshire. I think you're right. This could well be a domino for what happens with other franchises. Telling as well, I think that they've got like full control. There is a path at least to full control of the 100 franchise, because that's what the ECB have been telling us, is that these are the most valuable parts of the county game right now. And we built this from nothing, which if that plays out, then fair play to them. They've done a good job. And that competition is in some ways, despite being much maligned for elements, which some of which justified, some of which are not, you'd say that that's kind of achieved what it wanted to achieve. The other thing that I think will be really kind of will make it the value of this is whether or not by bringing in the investment, suddenly we start seeing some of the Indian talent, or at least some of the talent in these like multi-franchise groups that are mostly based out of Indian investment, whether or not that brings some of those star players over into the 100, because that is really an area where it's lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the 100 wants to be the second biggest domestic franchise tournament in cricket. We all know who first is, and that's not going to change. But that's becoming harder with IPL franchises buying up stakes in other leagues. You've got South Africa's competition, you've got the new Major League Cricket in the US, for example. But the 100's weird. I know that's not a particularly hot take, but like, you know, the ECB tend to be quite closed off when it comes to the financials around that, which is their right. But 3 seasons in, fourth now, the jury's still out on its commercial viability. I mean, like, I think there's been reports that the average 100 team makes about £500,000 a year, you know, and you sort of think, how can you come up with an 8-figure value for a franchise that turns over less than £1 million a year? You're investing in potential to an extent. You know, the 100 is still fledgling. It's of a much surer footing. I feel last year actually it found its feet a lot more. Yeah, there's a lot riding on these deals. Like the existing debt among counties has been valued at something like around £200 million. It shows you like how much of a challenge that is in terms of the county game, how much of a mess, I guess, it's in. The ECB and the counties, I think, are probably going to have to concede a bit more ground at the negotiating table in order to get this cash injection they're seeking. How that transpires, I'm not sure. It could be the investor having more control of the venue, as you say, getting to sort of pick and choose, holding events there in terms of like extra stuff, not just cricket. So like concerts, other entertainment gatherings, stuff like that. But also like the investors need to be convinced they're going to get a decent return on their outlay in good time. I guess if discussions do kind of remain deadlocked, you know, if we don't get any more announcements in the coming months, you know, hundreds of millions of pounds are going to be left on the table, you know, and that the ripple effect that could be disastrous. I mean, you know, aside from the fact the 100 it's going to dent the 100's ambition to be one of the top short format leagues in the world, you know, be considered in that the best of the rest, if you like, after the IPL. But the financial uncertainty around the domestic game is going to be even bigger. So it could be that this deal for Hampshire and indeed the Brave is a precursor. Exactly how that is received within, you know, the wider cricketing fandom. You know, it's a sport that's not short of traditionalism. I can sort of imagine MCC members sort of becoming particularly more crusty at the prospect of sort of the family county silver being sold off. But that's the world we live in now. You know, we saw it this week, like Twickenham's just sold the naming rights to Allianz. It's going to be the Allianz Stadium from September. That's the first time it's done that in 107 years of the stadium. So, you know, times they are changing. And if traditional sports like your rugbys and your crickets, where there is interest, but, you know, wages are going up, revenue is, particularly in rugby, it has not caught up, then the wider game is going to suffer. And that, you know, creates a sort of a vicious circle. So I think when we do our end of year wrap up, I would be interested to see how many more deals in county cricket and indeed for the 100 are done. Because if no more have been announced, then it's going to be testing 2025, I think, for English cricket.
So you said this would be the start of a domino at the start of this conversation, and now you're saying we could be looking at testing the situation.
I'm keeping my options open.
Yeah, probably we'll end up somewhere in the middle. The world never really gives us a definitive answer on anything, but I don't think this is going to be the first such agreement of its kind. Cricket is going to be at the LA 2028 games, which are being hosted, as we've mentioned, in Los Angeles. Also being hosted, I guess, by the USOPC, insofar as they are the Home Olympic Association. Now, as we sort of mentioned a couple of times as well in this podcast, our colleague Sam Carp has been in Paris. He's been absolutely zipping all over the city, interviewing people left, right, and centre. One of those people was USOPC CEO Sarah Hirshland, who runs Team USA. And for this part of this conversation is a fascinating insight into how the USOPC is funded. Now, in the UK, Team GB, our Olympians, are awarded grants by a central funded UK sport body, which raises a lot of money through the National Lottery. In the US, the situation's a little bit different. Sam was asking Sarah Hirshland about how that works, how that's funded, and how that might change in the years to come. So we can cut straight into that conversation now.
I guess the goal now is kind of to grow in terms of growing revenues also. How do you kind of view the financial health of the organisation today? Obviously, there have been a few things that probably have put a bit of a dent in those finances recently. Obviously, in 2021, the settlement that you reached with the gymnasts was part of that. I know, obviously, the USOPC wasn't responsible for paying all of that, but I'm sure it had an impact. How do you kind of view
certainly. We've been really fortunate to have very consistent revenue growth, quad over quad, which is, as we think about financial planning, we do it on quad cycles. So we've had the luxury of revenue growth allowing us to continue to make those investments. Mm-hmm. You're right. We made some investments that probably weren't exactly where you'd want to put them, right, when you're in a litigation settlement. But fundamentally, we've been able to sustain the organization and do some of those things. Going forward, we have to continue to think about where we make investments. And some of that is in growing revenue. They always say you can't make money without spending money. And so we're going to have to make some investments to drive the commercial value of the organization as well. And we'll do that. And we've got to invest in Team USA on a continued basis. There are lots of places where we'd like to continue to make investments, and we'll do that as we have the revenue to do it. But our trajectory of revenue growth is there. The question is just at what rate. That growth can slow or it can accelerate, but I don't see any pathway in which our revenue isn't growing. Mm-hmm. That's a nice problem to have. Financially, we're quite strong.
I know that obviously you're in this kind of quite unique joint venture with LA28 in terms of how you're selling sponsorships at the moment, and there's a guarantee obviously within that. You talk about growing revenue and looking at where are you looking to invest to grow that revenue, given that I guess the sponsorship side at the moment is kind of accounted for?
It is a little bit, although I always say we have to earn the value, and there's always opportunity to create more value. So commercially, our focus is on how do we create value, and really looking at the long term. Yes, there's the next 4 years before LA, but more importantly, what are we investing in today to create value for the long term? So we've done a lot with making Team USA as a great example. You've seen us really start to think about what's the qualification journey, how do we bring those stories to life and give an activation platform to sponsors as an example. But in the next 4 years, our actual revenue growth will likely largely come from philanthropy. We launched a $500 million campaign. Our goal is to be at 225 by the end of the year. We'll hit that goal, which puts us in a nice position to have an ability to potentially even exceed our 500 million by the end of 2028. But we're leaning heavily on the philanthropic community in the United States, and thus far they're responding nicely.
Pardon my ignorance here, maybe, because that's quite different to how it works in the UK, for example, where the government invests in a lot of the national governing bodies. Yeah, who's kind of contributing to those donations? Is it, I'm sure maybe some of them are anonymous, but how do you go out and just kind of lobby that support?
Philanthropy in the U.S., you're right. We're 100% privately funded between businesses and philanthropists and individuals. We have donations, I think, I'm going to get this number roughly right, maybe 65,000, 70,000 donors in a calendar year. This year, that number should go up. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of individuals across the United States who are contributing. Some are contributing $10. Yep. Some are contributing. We just announced a $25 million gift by Mark and Mary Stevens. So $25 million gift is a very significant contribution from a family. Mm-hmm. So it is a wide range of the types of gifts that we're getting, from those who have the capacity to make transformational gifts like a $25 million gift, down to individuals who just say, I want to help. I'll give you $10. And all of that matters. Yep. And we're grateful for every one of them.
I saw an example of that during this Olympics already, right, with the USA rugby team who,
that's right.
I think, we've spoken about Simone Biles, and then I guess Katie Ledecky is another one who, obviously those are the ones who steal the headlines a lot of the time. But I think that bronze medal was quite symbolic of the growth that's happening in that sport in the US at the moment as we lead up to 28 and also lead up to the country hosting the Rugby World Cup. But it was notable after, obviously, that Ilona Maher, who's kind of established herself as one of the stars of these games, she went straight to, the funding question and investment. And then, within moments of that, Michelle Kang was pledging $4 million. Kind of at that NGB level at the moment, then what's it kind of like for those guys in terms of funding? I guess it's quite a tough sponsorship environment for them too.
It's difficult. And, each of the NGBs is a different size with different capacity to fundraise and to drive sponsorship revenue. So part of our job is to try to help there where we can. We have what we call our Sport Ambassador program, where we'll actually solicit donors who have an interest in a particular sport and allow that donor to give specifically into a sport that they're in love with. But we do the work to steward the donor, doing the paperwork, the tax paperwork, all of the things that have to be done from a sort of an administrative perspective, which gives the donor a lot of confidence. It doesn't make sense for a small NGB to have the capability to do all of those things. So it's working well. Michelle Kang is a great example of someone who sees a need, right? And on the completely opposite side of the spectrum, Flava Flav, right? Stepped in and said to the women's water polo team, hey, I'm going to help you guys out. Gave them some money, but also became their hype man to help grow the visibility of the sport. And I was at the game last night against France, and he's there doing everything he can to try to create energy and awareness of the sport. Both of those are important, right? The financial support is important, and it is really as simple as these guys have to get on airplanes and travel around the world to compete in order to earn the rankings points and get there. Something as simple as the cost of travel can be thousands and thousands of dollars over the course of a season. So every little bit helps, and it's about the dollars and it's about the awareness. And we love anybody who wants to help with either one.
Just going back to LA 28 then, in terms of, I suppose, the sponsorship side of things at the moment, I think a few people have maybe observed that progress has perhaps been a bit slower than may have been expected. And obviously Salesforce dropped out, I think, earlier this year also. From where you sit, what have you made of that process so far? Has it surprised you at all? Were you expecting a bit of a acceleration on the back of Paris?
Yeah, well, look, I think we're feeling really, really optimistic at the moment. And I think the brand community and the corporate community, the feedback we've gotten over the last just 2 weeks through conversations is exactly where we'd want to be. So that feels great. The pandemic was difficult. And both the Tokyo and Beijing games were difficult for the corporate community in the United States in particular, but really globally. And so, there's a bit of catch up to play, no doubt. And with the timing of the LA games, we've been feeling that for sure. But we're sitting right where we want to be now, knowing that this has really reawakened the consumer engagement, all the things that the corporate community needs to have confidence in, television ratings, social engagement, to say, okay, I know that the value is here. So we're excited. The conversations that are happening with the USOPP and the LA 28 team and Team USA are, many of them, well advanced. And so we're in a good position. The next 6 to 12 months is going to be very important as people come into the planning cycle for the LA games. But I have a lot of confidence that we're going to be exactly where we need to be.
Yeah, for sure. Because I guess if you're a brand, you're wanting to get in there sort of 3 years beforehand, so you can plan, right?
You've got to do some work. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So I guess still quite confident. I guess the target for LA 28 is probably double, I think, what Paris 2024 did, roughly.
I don't know the Paris numbers well enough to know that.
It was 1.3 billion euros, so I'm not going to try and convert it right here. But
we'd love to do double that. Yes.
So still quite confident, I guess, of hitting that target.
Sure, yeah. LA's been pretty transparent about where their budget sits. And obviously they're in the same position we are, which is they can spend what they make. So the more you can make on the front end, the more sizzle and they'll be able to put into those games.
Yeah. And then you touched on kind of what it takes for athletes to fly around the world and the challenges of that if you're an Olympian and perhaps not a really high profile Olympian. It's a massive commitment, not just physically, financially as well. One of the things we're seeing in Paris for the first time is some prize money being distributed by World Athletics. Obviously that sport got underway last night. Based on what you've said so far, would I be right to assume that you're in support of that and rewarding those athletes?
I'm enormously in support of putting money in athletes' pockets. 100%. And obviously we'll pay the same, what we call Operation Gold medal bonuses that we have. And I'd love to pay double. And my goal and my hope is that by the time we get to LA, we are putting significantly more money in athletes' pockets, not just for performance, but performance at every step, right? Making this team is a feat in and of itself, let alone getting yourself onto the podium. And we want to make sure that we're getting money in athletes' pockets. So it's a high priority for us.
Where does that come from? I guess who's the onus on, I suppose, to grow that pie? Is it on brands to invest more? Because I suppose if we talk a lot about the stories at the Olympics, and the untold stories is a lot of the thing, and that happens every 4 years. And so you watch it and you'll be like, well, why haven't I known about this person before? Who is the onus on to tell that? Surely the brands have a role to play in kind of elevating that and putting more money in those athletes' pockets.
I mean, you're right. The answer is everybody. We live in a world today where an athlete can build their own brand and tell their own story, and our job is to help them do that. Mm-hmm. We're creating both something as simple as a technology platform in our athlete marketing platform to help them do that, but also just education on how to think about building a social brand if that's something an athlete wants to do. So it starts with the athlete and how they choose to show up, how we can support and help that. Then you start to bring in brands, the storytelling that we'll do. So it's a yes and. There's no one way to say somebody's going to tell the story. It's all of us have to tell the story. And the more coordinated we are in that, the greater the impact you're going to have. I think we have 594 athletes here. And I'd love for the American consumer to be able to name more than 10 of them, right? If that can happen, then we know we're doing our job. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it show up. And part of that is also the breadth and diversity of sports that are winning medals. When athletes show up on the podium, they show up on our consciousness. Mm-hmm. When you see sports like fencing and rowing and archery, winning medals, hopefully it awakens the American consumer to say, there's some really extraordinary human beings here, and let's understand who they are. Our job is to humanize them and give America a look at who they are as people, not just as athletes.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think, just in terms of what World Athletics is doing as well, do you think we'll maybe see other federations start to do that? I guess it's a question of finances, right? And if you've got the capability.
Yeah, I won't speak on behalf of any of the federations because I don't know what conversations may or may not be happening. But certainly, I think the whole ecosystem is eager to grow. There are lots of places that are worthy of resources. And so the challenge always becomes, how do you generate the resources? And then how do you allocate them? Mm-hmm. And every organization, whether it's a National Olympic Committee or an international federation or all the way at the IOC level, is trying to figure out how do you grow resources and then how do you make smart choices about allocating them. Lots of different decisions are going to be made there.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sam. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Thanks a lot, Ed. Just a reminder, actually, to check out the Olympic briefings, which if you haven't, you should definitely be doing so already. They are lovely short episodes, which we've been putting out over the course of the Paris 2024 Games. Most recent one dropped on Tuesday. The next one will be dropping tomorrow on Friday. And that's probably a good place to leave it. Thanks, listeners. Bye.